Hi, guys, and welcome back. So, a few months ago, I said I would try to do a review of the historiography and kind of my recommendations of books that go over the constitutional history and basically explain how our understanding of the constitutional period, the ratification, the the Convention of 1787, all that. And I kind of think right now, kind of understanding how our Constitution was created, the concessions, kind of the pros and cons, and how our knowledge of the Founding Fathers is probably not as complete as we would like. Some of that was by their own attention. A lot of Founding Fathers had their official papers and then they had their private papers. For instance, a lot of love letters George Washington wrote to his wife Martha got burned. Um, a lot of a lot of founders purposefully burned their private letters, so we only have their official thoughts, and they basically made sure that we only saw the side to them that they wanted us to see. There are exceptions. For instance, John Adams, because he had a temper. He was always very open about how he felt, and a lot of that is also because we have the heartwarming letters he and Abigail wrote to each other. Honestly, John Adams kind of knew he dug himself into a hole, and uh, he is popularly remembered, I'm not sure if it's actually true, as to saying, Lord help me if they ever find my letters. So, so yeah, like, and so to kind of start off with our timeline of how we kind of got here and our understanding of the Constitution, it's probably important we start with some of the earliest schools. You have the historian Bancroft, who is probably one of the most important founders of the field of U.S. history, to such a degree that one of the top prizes in writing history books in the United States is called the Bancroft Prize. Now, Bancroft is an important figure in the Whig slash neo Whig school of American constitutional history. The Whigs and the early writers of the U.S. constitutional history made a lot of their focus in writing the U.S. history as the founders being of divine origin. Before you have the Whigs, a lot of the writers of the American Revolution and the constitutional period were anti-federalists or more Jeffersonian supporters, so they kind of castigated the Constitution and those who supported it, with some exception to Washington, but not that much. Their main target was usually John Adams, and that was because, um, as much as the Hamilton musical uh, likes to cast the main political argument spectrum being between Alexander Hamilton and Jefferson, for most of the constitutional period and well into the presidencies of Adams and Jefferson, these two were the actual leaders of their party for the most part, and a lot of their fights were based actually on their differences in economic, national, and foreign policy. And a lot of their letters to each other did show that. And that's not to say no one knew Hamilton was important. They did. But if we're actually talking about people who had the charisma and power to lead their party and the nation, it was Adams and Jefferson. Now, once you get past the Anti Federalists and the Whigs, you get to the progressive school of thought, whose leader was largely Charles Beard. Charles Beard is important in the fact that he kind he really took on the progressive school of thought that focused more on economics and what we nowadays call social studies, and took on a lot of methodology that kind of came from the Marxist school of history. Uh, Before anyone says anything, the Marxist school of history has nothing to do with communism or socialism. It's more of a methodology that does, yes, look at economics and class, but also takes on other schools of research such as social studies, psychology, sociology, economics, and uses these tools as to help better understand and look through historical periods to kind of expand the narrative, expand the focus is what I'm trying to say. Now, Charles Beard's book is called an Economic Interpretation of the Constitution. Now, the book focuses on the economic interests of the United States and the founders. A lot of days, a lot of people are they're willing to admit Beard had points, but using the Constitution as a primarily economic document just hasn't lasted, it hasn't aged well. We're able to reconcile his work as an important moment of when we actually are trying to look at the Constitution and the people who wrote it as humans breaking away from like this divine origin story and into saying, yes, the founders had other reasons to do it. And in that way, and it really is more his methodology that is his main legacy, not the progressive school of historiography, although we do still try to see the economic patchwork that the Constitution does have. The next phase of reading the Constitution is McDonald's We the People. Now, McDonald wrote during the height of the Cold War. The height of the Cold War, especially in the 1950s, early 1960s, was dominated by consensus historians who were very much writing in the time period they were. They were trying to make it look like the Constitution, the people who wrote it, were more on the same page than they actually were. They tried to make it sound like they were basically trying to send a message to the people of the 1950s and 60s saying the US was in danger, especially from natives during the constitutional period. There was this instability. They were able to band together and made this document and the union that lasts to this day. We got to do that now. In reality, well, let's just say everyone hated Rhode Island. In fact, several people wanted to be like, is there any way we can be be the United States without Rhode Island because we hate them? So, yeah. And McDonald was mostly making this work also to target Charles Beard's work and trying to basically end the school of progressive history. And in reality, he actually did more to solidify Beard's methodology by trying to attack his work. So it also kind of backfired on McDonald. But the consensus school of US history is also one that actually probably has the longest lasting legacy because a lot of US history books that are meant for schools to this day are still stuck in consensus history. And and whenever you hear arguments made by historians who are like, we need to standardize history, we have to reform reform our understanding of US history, that's because a lot of them do recognize a lot of the historiography and narratives used in the US history books hasn't really updated in tone since the consensus school back in the 1950s and 60s. Once you get past that, you get to the revisionist slash post revisionist history of the Constitution, and um, and this one's less easy to kind of divide like I did with progressives and consensus. The the best way I can describe the revisionists and revisionists, the left, the new right, is by trying to explain it as this. The revisionist school was more focused on bringing into the narrative the plight of natives, the plight of enslaved peoples, especially in the South, and kind of acknowledgement that even people in New York still had interests in keeping slavery, and the fact that even though the New England area had was one of the first peoples to and colonies and states to really try to end slavery, they they were still tied with it because of their mercantile interests. And that and a lot of people who do try to focus on this is usually when we go through the ratification process that is encapsulated by Pauline Meir's work, Ratification. Um, she doesn't really do much with 1787 or the convention. She really tries to just focus on the ratification process, which in a lot of history books is hand waved, and while in reality, yes, like New England, Georgia, like a lot of states that knew they were weakened or like they had more chance to really survive the oncoming economic crisis that was caused by runaway inflation because of overprinting of state bonds, the continental dollar, counterfeiting, the fact that Rhode Island basically ruined the New England economy by selling a bunch of worthless bonds. The fact that there really was this runaway speculation in land that would take down a lot of founding fathers. Like, Pauline Meir focuses on and brings back to a certain degree Beard's focus on like what was everyone's interest, like what would convince people to ratify the Constitution, the fact that both her and Beard did agree to a certain extreme the Federalists did use some underhanded tactics. And she, more than anything else, brings the ratification process into a narrative of great man history, but with like the idea of like the whole ratification process was this political drama where everyone was being extremely over dramatic. The fact that these great men had egos to match their stature, that like they would attack each other in newspapers, like the Federalist Papers in a lot of ways reads as the how I would put in one of my papers when I was doing my master's in history was a philosophy student who was doing an all-nighter while drinking four Red Bulls. Like, because a lot of these arguments, especially by Hamilton, was repetitive. A lot of the more original stuff really was written by John Jay and James Madison. Hamilton was important. I'm not denying he was. I'm just saying the Federalist Papers, especially when it comes to him, he repeated himself a lot. Um, the next, um, the next person I do want to highlight is Plain Honest Men by Richard Beeman. Now, this book I cannot recommend enough because it's actually a very easy on your eyes read. Richard Beeman does the opposite of Pauline Meir, where he mostly focuses on the U.S. Constitutional Convention in 1787. In fact, I would probably pair these two together because a lot of their narratives do seem to transition into each other, and he actually more focuses on the fact that the society that created these men is alien to us. Like, this is a society that just finished the witch hunts, that still, that their standard of religion is similar to ours in the fact that it was diverse. This was a society that was going to turn into ours, but still had so many trappings of the previous generations that yes, these men did want to try to create a stronger union, but it wasn't all agreed upon. These men came from the northern mercantile interests, southern slave interests, somewhere in between when we're talking about Maryland, New York, and Virginia. These people also had egos, agendas, and views of themselves that were, it kind of feels like at times that they were trying to make their own great man history. Franklin by this point was old and really only had a few years left, and everyone kind of knew it. So that's kind of why I would pair Beeman and Meir together. Then you have Holton, who in many ways is how, I don't know how I would describe Holton's work outside of like, in many ways it feels like he is a successor to Beard in the fact that he really does bring back the economic focus, and but he does it in a way that really does emphasize the difference in class. The fact that the Federalists, for the most part, even Adams, who really wasn't upper class, he actually got more of his position by merit and education, but that education in many ways made him come off as more elitist, while Jefferson, who was very much upper class Virginian, saw himself more as somewhere between being with the people and the upper class that he was born into. Now, Holton is an amazing historian. He he brings back economics and class that a lot of historians nowadays are focusing on and trying to point out in many ways. The Constitution did create barriers for people who were deemed lower class to really have a voice in government because, in many ways, the Federalists feared too much democracy and fears of mob rule. And a lot of the reasons why the Federalists kind of peaked and ended with Adams was Washington and Adams were the presidents during the French Revolution. They kind of saw the French Revolution as proof that they were right. While that's not addressed in this book, you kind of see the mindset of like the Federalists being like, all right, our currency is worthless, these state bonds are worthless, we need defense against natives, we need to, for the people in the South, we need a stronger government to ensure slave revolts don't happen. Like, Holton focuses on, like, we need a, a bank, we need a government that has the ability to make our money worth something. These government debts that we bought up, we want returns on these. And in a lot of ways, that's kind of why I argue he probably is more articulate and actually cites his sources a lot better than Beard ever did. So, and in a lot of ways, the reason why, like, the middle and lower class, even though the book does portray, like, does portray the Constitution as being more of a upper class thing, is because a lot of the middle and lower class wanted stability. A lot of them wanted to actually have the ability to go out west, to, if they wanted to stay, be able to have their debts handled so that they could succeed on their farms. And that in many ways Holton speaks to kind of like basically saying everyone kind of had an interest, so in many ways he tries to bridge McDonald rather indirectly and Beard again rather indirectly into making a working narrative of these were the interests that brought people to the table for the Constitution. And while these alliances, especially between Madison and Hamilton, would not last, they at least understood the need enough to be halfway on board. Now, this book is this next book I'm going to mention isn't a constitutional history book. It's written more as lessons of understanding our founders. The, the book is called American Dialogue, The Founders and Us. It was written by Joseph Ellis, published in 2018. And in a lot of ways, this book it's an amazing book. You'll learn a lot from it. But Ellis isn't without controversy. He lied about his involvement in Vietnam. He does have scandal to him, but nothing that would detract from the book. Although the book does write as kind of an attack on the narrative Trump is trying to spin on American history, so just warning, if you read this book and you're wondering if it's an attack on Trump, more than likely it is. And while I agree with this book, and just be aware there is a bias. And in many ways, Ellis is kind of taking the narratives and lessons that we should have taken from the founding fathers and kind of points these issues as to kind of linking them with works like Eric Foner and Henry Louis Gates Jr., especially Stony the Road. Trying to point out kind of the more reactionary tones and takeaways we kind of inherited from the founders that in many ways is kind of woven into the system. The fact that Jefferson and Adams fought on the fact that Adams was kind of aware that you do realize we're going to have a American aristocracy some days. We might as well build it into the system so that we can force the future American aristocracy of money into buying titles that don't mean or contribute to anything, but the money they spend on them goes to the American people. While Jefferson hoped, especially during his presidency, he could create a system of yeoman farmers where everyone's equal unless you were a slave. It kind of points out Jefferson's hypocrisy on slavery, where in many ways he was an abolitionist, and granted, yes, he owned slaves, yes, he had kids with his slaves. Everyone at the time knew that. But he was kind of the main person that ensured that the Ohio Territory would be made of free states. That during his time as governor of Virginia, he created laws that ensured religious freedom. A lot of the Great Awakening and the growth of Methodists and Baptists really does tie to a lot of his freedom of religion policies. But as he got older, he became more reactionary, and he especially had to make concessions that Adams was right. American aristocracy was going to happen. The French Revolution failed. Napoleon made himself an emperor. And with the fall of Napoleon, the Bourbon dynasty came back. Basically, Jefferson had ideals, but as he got older, he became the person that wanted to kick the can down the road, have things like slavery, issues of foreign policy that him and Adams kind of created, especially with like trying to balance interests in France and Britain. He very much kind of became that person that said, this is the next generation's problem I don't want to talk about anymore, even though I kind of made the issue. Like, so this is probably the best way to kind of end here. Oh, and one more thing. So yeah, this is kind of where I kind of want to end by saying that the US Constitution was written by humans who were both byproducts of their time, but were trying to be forward thinking enough to actually mean what they were saying when they say trying to create a more perfect union. They had their biases, their interests, their fears. All that does get put into the Constitution, and in many ways, what we have left of them, the parts of them that they want us to see, how we handle them has to be on us. So, please consider picking up these books and try to figure out what lessons you want to take away. Have a good one.